Hello everyone, today we talk about the expansion of the medieval Western civilization during its peak of the 13th century. You're not stranger to this topic, especially if you have been following me for a while, but it's always important to further deepen the understanding of this crucial period and sort of observing it from different points of view. I have, I think, more than 100 videos on the 13th century alone specifically, but Schwerpunkt's goals are actually to explore it far and wide. And if you actually look at the entirety of the topic, let's say in a broader historical, cultural, moral sense, such amount of videos so far is also pretty meager. So we're not exaggerating, really, and it's also just an evergreen in stressing how sort of underrated in general this period is, because if you do not appreciate it, you cannot really appreciate fundamentally the entire notion of the Middle Ages as one of a great civilization, and the actual evidence of why this was the case. So today we will not talk too much about universal authorities, for example, nor about the general Catholic sense of discipline and order that was given to this world. We will appreciate a bit the boundaries of the same and in this sense, the general proportion of the story, not numerically, not in this sort of precise quantities that are also very difficult to provide, because we have just an idea of how big the civilization was. Actually, the best documentation in the Middle Ages follows this period, and follows especially like the beginning of the crisis that began to manifest, at least on the horizon, in the last decade of the century, and that would bring, in fact, the contraction to sort of secularize and modernize a bit, also as much as the preservation, the conservation of that memory, of the starting to economize more on resources that before were just springing out wildly to a point, and without necessarily like pre-existing, for example, institutions or political frames. Recently I made that video on at least the ones that we came to know later, especially in fact in later Middle Ages, with the statalization of national monarchies, etc. We discussed this in the other in that video about the 12th, 13th century Western European political territorial recompaction and the hierarchy that was, formalized in a feudal sense under the reign of Louis IX in France. That was also a bit like the model for the other countries where this greater Frankish Latin word spread mostly from. And of course, we have lots of videos starting from Clovis chronologically that sort of illustrate how that happened. But we will not focus on a country only. Right, we will today take into consideration the whole, right? And Abulafia, that, as you know, is quite a scholar of the era, stresses rightfully, I would say, the notion of the expansion during this period. Like the 13th century, if it were just from a quantitative point of view, again, demographically, economically, just territorially, is in itself insane, right? But these scholars haven't observed too much. It's sort of the actual reasons why, sort of structuralist or post-structuralist, at least influenced academia. That's not much where the attention was directed towards. We'll not talk about this, at least today. We'll see, if anything, the reflection of that. The expansion of Latin Christendom during the 13th century is obvious. Really, this is really the peak of it, not just externally but internally, right? People focus very much on the Crusades in general, and this was actually the century in which the Holy Land was lost by the Christians. In general, however, this is also the century in which, for example, the Reconquista is accomplished. After Las Navas, all the Islamic Iberian rulers become vassals of the Christian ones. You have a massive expansion in the Baltic. You have a further, say, from this internal compartments, like the Germanic world during the Ostsiedlung, reaching the peak of this eastwards colonization. You have the conquest of Constantinople, the establishment of the Latin Empire, of Romania, and more, right? Because the economical expansion, for example, of the Italian maritime republics reaches its peak of flow of traffic. There is a broader, as we'll see now, global perspective that the Westerners are eager to pursue. There are lots of Europeans in China at this point, thanks to the Pax Mongolica that had been established, like breaking essentially the major say toll exacting institutions in the center of Asia for that, in fact, continental traffic, in spite of the destruction same brought by the Mongol invasions and the same invasion of Europe. As we explained in a video regarding the latter aspect, there wasn't really much that the Europeans suffered in comparison. The system kept expanding dramatically. I also made videos explaining how the Westerners displayed an incredible sense of observation, but also the lack of explicit judgment. They just were working for it. They were going beyond and silently but consistently building up their civilization. Another very underrated aspect in this sense is how, and that's why I said, I also made a video about the siege of Acre, 1291, the fall of the last, not quite literally the last avampost in the Levant, nor even just properly on the Asian continental coast, but still one that sort of we'll talk about the Crusades more, and also the historiographical perspectives of things like this was worthless, or it was doomed to fail since the beginning. It wasn't really so. But the underrated aspect is how much the Latins, Western Christendom, impacted at this point the Orthodox as well as the Islamic world. Right, this can be seen in so many ways. Right, Western feudalism had been spreading far and wide already before this point. This is really the peak, and also from a financial point of view, basically there are some failed states that emerge. The aforementioned Romania is one of them. At the end of the day, the Balkans are engulfed into a mess that also the same Latins pay for in a way. Even the loss of the Holy Land, the Mamluk takeover is accompanied by some sort of provincialization of certain areas. Syria is infested by the Mongols of the Persian Ilkhanate. There are also, as you know, Western projects of Mongol alliance that we discussed in multiple videos that deal with the possibilities of bailing out the Levant, but to still put pressure on the Muslims to an extent. And this, let's say, what will happen in the later 13th century and the 14th is, in part, actually throughout all the early part of the 14th century, we have this massive system by scale still standing, aside from the sort of the stopping the tipping of the curve and the gradual stagnation. But the also crisis of the mid-14th century and what came with it was, first of all, a worldwide phenomenon. Like the general crisis did not strike more the West than, say, China or India or the Middle East, whatever. It was pretty generalized, and we'll come back on that topic for sure as well. And what actually you see, and I think this is a very interesting let's say, model. There is a pattern here regarding what kind of power actually, say, what kind of power gets the worst from crisis. It's actually not the small ones. There are cases, of course, let's say the greater universal powers do decline, but we're talking about powers that had not been really founded on major regional assets. Let's say Germany, for example, collapsed in a monarchic national sense at the very peak, actually, of the same feudal development in the 13th century. The same papacy was not really a major regional superpower in a military sense. But if you look at France, that remains that sort of paradigm. If you look at also the Iberian Peninsula to an extent, you realize that eventually, also towards the early modern age, these were essentially the more stable systems, the ones that took very heavy blows sometimes. They were shattered much more, actually, at the roots, at their roots than others even. But that sort of came back prepotently in the history of civilization to actually reach almost an hegemonic role. I'm talking very long term, up to the 17th century. So, and with cyclical crises that did not knock themselves out from. So what happens, for example, in Central Europe with a crisis is not something that would salvage the system more than what happened, for example, in Western Europe. It is the one that really went on further again. But going back to the 13th century, the underrated aspect we were talking about before is that this massive extension, also geographically, that came to encroach the Orthodox, the Islamic world, also the pagan territories. We're talking the Baltic here, that had previously existed on its periphery. The growth in the previous centuries had been harsh. We're still talking about pre-industrial systems, etc. So also the 13th century wasn't, I don't know, of course, a level of industrial development, but I think, to my estimate, that really in relative terms there has never been such great growth. Maybe just the Roman Imperial one, even though there were sort of, even there, moments of stagnation. There is the 2nd century BC crisis. There is also there is the 3rd century crisis later on, but that at least was a moment in which things stopped growing. In absolute terms, the system was entering a crisis in shrinking, like all the rest of the world as well. It wasn't unique to this or that system. But here you have, like, from literally the 8th to the, and all with important crises that occurred in between, like a constant and enormous growth that I do not know other perspectives in the history of mankind. Just literally Rome from the 4th to the 2nd century BC can compare, and that was sort of driven by a single power that sort of managed to connect, say, resources that were there, and that, if anything, is to appreciate because of the moral conviction that made in creating the Romano-Italic Confederacy, a granitic bloc that took over literally the Mediterranean. In Europe, here you find instead a generalized growth, right, of a system that, in fact, I think we should appreciate for how actually distinguished, like, and unitary it actually was in an imperial Catholic sense. And so even when we look at the differences of the various nationalities, as we are especially used to since the 19th century, sort of blocks on their own, we're actually missing often the upper echelons of this. Not just because the 13th century, as we said before, is the peak of universalism, but also because these peoples truly thought of themselves to be part of a world. It was also becoming ever more self-aware, and that had always been directed by the empire, by the papacy in a joint sense across European countries from a very long time, from actually even before the Middle Ages. And that's all a part of history that we must really recover. because it's important to, as we see also from my historical regional series, to look at the national side of the story, because without that you wouldn't understand even the individual accomplishments within the system. But the sense that Europe had been crossed by specific axes, especially in the West, but not only, that had essentially brought these peoples to cooperate and to work together, even fighting, even building up. We were talking about it the other day in the video about the role of the Germans, right, and in their toughening up of the system, creating sort of a more, let's say, seriously believing or re-injecting this concreteness of belief in a magical relation in terms of imperial power between one another, lord or another, etc., that had truly brought to the feudal establishment. And so what had really been pulling the cart or directing it, at least from the above, guiding all these colonists, these merchants, these craftsmen, and the same, let's say, also like there was the ecclesiastical world as well that did the same identical thing. So we see these groups doing basically the same, right? For example, commercially speaking, if you look at the Italians, the Germans, the Catalans, you realize that these people were pushing all directions available, deeper into the Mediterranean, the Baltic, and the very heart of the European continental hinterland. The expansion of the population, which only began to stabilize around the beginning of the 14th century, exactly because people were sort of now needing that the system had expanded so dramatically. You needed something to keep it together, including settling people for good, right? Whereas before there was a much greater mobility within the system as a whole. You have the expansion of governmental authority, as we've seen, the statalization, the institutionalization of specific, mostly feudal monarchies that only at this point sort of start fixing something more centrally organized. And finally, the consolidation of, in fact, royal power over their dominions, with also the papacy reaching the peak at this point during the pontificate of Innocent III, when basically all Western monarchies were technically recognizing themselves as papal vassals. Plus more, you have the Ruthenian Palatinate converting to, or at least having, that the specific agreements with the Roman Church to reunite the churches, as they had been at least ideally separated from the 11th century, also that had never quite been sort of formally categorically officialized in many ways. And so there was still, and especially at this point, a lot of room for amalgamating the whole system. We've seen how the same Lithuanians, that were the last pagans of Europe, were actually at this point talking with Rome, because they knew that even just the prospect of them Christianizing, especially with the Teutonic Knights on their side, could be managed with a papacy in a way that could make leverage in the region. So the system becomes so interconnected, even in the most faraway fringes, that the affirmation, especially of dominance in a traditional sense, in a hierarchy, and some solid vision of what the system had to work like. Think about scholastics, so properly an idea of an entire scientific system that has to provide, in a reference sense, the certainty on what the world stands, is possible to be even thought in this time. And by the end of the century, the political and demographic growth of the major European kingdoms and cities was particularly evident in an unprecedented fashion, like multiple layers of city rings built around, for example, the Roman one. This is especially the case in the Italian communes. The pressure that, for example, such a powerful lord like the King of England was making on all across the British Isles even after having lost its ancestral French possessions after Bouvines, really shows you how, again, in this case, the still essentially a Latin Germanic word, the Latin Germanic word was capacity of challenging the Welsh princes and the Scottish monarchs. I made a video about Edward I's conquest of Wales. We've been talking a bit about what brought to the Scottish Wars of Independence. We talked about the Battle of Stirling Bridge and more. So these are all things we'll have to come back on. You have the Battle of Largs, like Norwegians having the power, naval and human alike, in the will and the force to threaten the stability of the Scottish kingdom. That also actually consolidates exactly on this occasion and becomes a veritable feudal monarchy. Exactly at this point, there's headed to do so. It fully happens during the Scottish Wars of Independence. There is an unprecedented political, statal, institutional profiling that goes in parallel with an immense growth in every field. There is also, of course, another world that grows. At this point, you should not you should consider more how big this Western, Latin, Frankish, whatever you want to call it, perspective is. But there is, of course, a lot regarding, for example, the Byzantine Greek world, the Slavic East as well, and even the Islamic one, because, of course, there were lots of Muslims still in Europe, in the Iberian Peninsula fundamentally. This was a time marked still by major crusades. So yes, eventually the fourth will end, but think about towards the Levant, but think about Louis IX's expeditions, the one to Egypt, the one still to Egypt but stopped in Tunisia, and that would have actually likely destroyed the local sultanate and allowed for the recapture of Jerusalem. Just the other day we were talking about Charles of Anjou and the fact that the Sicilian Vespers prevented him from actually taking back yet again Constantinople from, in this case, paradoxically, the Byzantines. Forgive the game of war, but because, as you know, those had managed to reconquer in turn the city from the Crusaders shortly before. There is Edward the First's, or the Aragonese expeditions during the ill-fated, the last and fatal Crusades expedition of Louis IX, that by themselves were just insanely massive military expeditions that were sort of forgotten because eventually things did not happen. But this is a moment in which a world that starts also from a documentary, a historiographical, this is very important, like you read the chronicles of the time, more recognizable to us in terms of sort of modern expression in thinking and storytelling, and is still capable of so much of what is a bit shrouded in the mystery instead of the previous times, in which we know that what happened at large, but we don't have, in fact, the sources telling us too much about what especially the participants in these rallies actually believe. This is actually what, like in every civilization, precedes the crisis. There is this, again, rationalization, this sense of, say, detachment from the action that starts becoming too burdensome and starts making you slow down compared to what you were habituated before, and sort of makes you lose the initiative, even in certain circumstances. So that's why the 13th century is considered actually as, by many historians, I can relate also in my experience. I heard many scholars saying essentially this is a bit of, let's say, the peak, not just the peak of the Middle Ages in many ways, but also the best compromise, for example, in terms of heuristic terms of documentation and research ratio, positivity, if you can so say, that is the funniest to research. I just finished an article actually on a late 13th century battle. I am actually more like about the first half of the 14th, where you in fact start seeing there is really a lot, even too much for a single scholar sources to simply dominate in a sort of profitable sense, also in a precisely scientific academic production, say. And so the world changes through this lens. The 13th century is a filter, is a turning point. It's definitely something bigger than other turning points. If anything, because the system was bigger, right? Every moment is a turning point, if you want, but it depends on what is actually turning, right? At this point, as we said, the spirit of Crusades was still very, very strong. Royalty, nobility, honor, these were peaking at this time, and if anything, they were beautifully incarnated by the top of in professionalism that, in a collective and individual sense alike, you can see expressed in the 13th century Western knight, right? More than that, because it was, say, knights existed all over Eurasia and beyond, but the level of structured, say, heaviness of spread of knighthood in the West, for all this enormous concentration of resources, of people, of moral capacity, is really insane, right? Here you have the most regularized also armies, so start changing towards, paradoxically, what is basically an old sort of knightly component as far as cavalry is concerned. Before, you had a greater segmentation, right? You had the squire that, yes, did fight, but it was not yet quite a technical, say, a professional fighter in itself. By the late 13th century, basically all cavalry that is fielded, aside from sort of lighter specialists, in fact, in an increasingly professional and monetized business, is like you have the same segmentation within, but basically the equipment is the same. They're all heavily armored at least. Infantry, as you know, also reaches its sort of peak of effectiveness and stratification. At this point, if there are not sole infantry victories, you have to wait for Courtrai in 1302, so starting a series of victories of that kind until at least the mid-14th century crisis that breaks the back of, in fact, those estates that express the infantry, the commoners, the rustics. You have really an incredible efficiency and compaction that is thwarted only by the peak of cavalry in a technical and moral sense on the battlefields. We'll make soon more videos about 13th century battles because they're really, really very important. These are the largest armies in the Middle Ages, by the way, late second half of the 13th, especially first half of the 14th century. And as you've seen, there were multiple targets also outside of the system: Egypt, Tunis, Islamic Spain, and Prussia, Livonia, etc. As you know, the Fourth Crusade itself was originally planned to take over the Nile Delta. That also would have been enough, really, to crush whichever civilization would rule from there, preventing the Crusaders to access Jerusalem from there. The Byzantine frailty, at least apparently, was a consequence of the same, say, crisis of the system within itself. As you know, the Crusaders were literally cold there, and basically they didn't even have to satisfy them in part. So aside from the vexata question of was the Byzantine Empire destined to be taken over by the Westerners? Was there something inherently wrong with its policy, with its system, whatever? The thing just, say, happened, right? If this had been a system, even for the fact that it was all about Constantinople, right, and that the empire had gotten down fundamentally just to that center in a general sense, and yes, eventually the Byzantines reconquered it, but as you know, nor Constantinople nor the empire was the same anymore, is in of itself like a sufficient comparison to what was happening in the West, that sort of did not back down, did not decline. That's consideration I was making the other day, how we should, of course, appreciate the Byzantine Empire. Made so many videos, just to defend the right to call it Byzantine, even though, yes, it was Roman, there is nothing actually criminal, and for very specific historical, cultural, and moral reasons to call it Byzantine, right, in a conventionally positive sense, and for, again, sort of also much deeper order reasons, by the way, especially in comparison to the rest of powers, both in space and in time. But we should celebrate the fact that it was a millennium long, not even, right? It lasted in the sense, yes, more than a millennium if you count 1453, but say also in its conquest in 1204, like it's around a millennium, say between 900 and 1100 years. And so we look at this timeline and say, wow, that's actually a lot. How many people do this with, say, England or France or Italy or Germany, right? You hardly look and say, well, more or less, these systems actually continued in their, aside from regime changes, institutional forms, still they were essentially these countries. And they went on as protagonists in Western history for such a very long time, and nobody seems to be amazed at that anymore. That's something which I personally think should be appreciated much more, and that instead we tend to neglect for reasons of self-sabotage that I will not explain, but that affect even our own view of the same 13th century. There was, if you want a broader failure to install the Roman Church in Greece, right? The Orthodox world was in itself the product of a different rate of growth, of a different, of a greater sparsity of population. At least in the Byzantine Empire, not more than much, but the Byzantine Empire is quite unique in itself. When you look at Eastern Europe and those countries that came to be under, let's say, the influence of Constantinople, made some videos about this, mostly talking about the age of the evangelization, say of the Bulgars, of the Khazars, of the Rus, etc. You realize that this world was sort of the, it had less gears compared to the West, and that's the reason why it was left behind, and why, in comparison to Rome, Constantinople sort of settled for it, while indeed the papacy was taking over basically like the entire Central Europe, the North, and more, and coming actually very close to do so also for much closer countries to Constantinople that at some point did flirt with the papacy for falling under its, within its sphere of influence. Another very underrated space is the Mediterranean. The Italians are truly hegemonic on the system. I recently made a video that explains how actually their trade dominance extended far beyond the same Mediterranean, not just within the same Europe, especially in a banking sense. It was properly developing at this point and behind most of the liquid transactions that financed the various military policies, let's say the kings of England or France or whatever, but far, like reaching as far as Guinea, India. As we were saying before, there are lots of Westerners in China, and it's difficult at a point to say in this huge system, it's easy to sort of look at the center and say, well, okay, here we have a lot to document in relative terms to other times of the Middle Ages, but still, it's not like we know exactly like everything about, say, in this case, the Italian presence, I don't know, in the Indian markets, for example. We know that there were, and the same can be said in terms of the Latin presence in Europe, in the broader German Ostsiedlung, like the fact that this broader Frankish world was did not know boundaries within the continent. It's as if, as we said before, like the eastern part, the less inhabited and so less densely populated, less connected, less urbanized, or barely urbanized, mostly central eastern part of the continent was simply sort of opening itself, especially by the local rulers that needed desperately to make something more consistent grow to counter the local nobility, like open dramatically to the west. We've seen, for example, in the Ruthenian panoplies, how radical Western influence really was. We think mostly at them, look at the Byzantine-styled icons, or at the Mongol influence as, we're basically a mix with that. Like the Kievan men-at-arms had beautiful Western German swords, right? And they were heading been for the Mongols that really turned the Eastern world upside down and marking it forever in that sense. Like much more similar, and this is true looking at properly not just the context but the general political institutional models, much more similar to Central Europeans, right, than Easterners. Like, it was a great similarity in that sense that stretched thus uninterruptedly from you can argue that the Rhine to the Volga, right? And that's especially a topic that I'm very interested in, because we tend to attribute this great unicity to or anti-Western characters to a world that actually developed largely because of the West in the first place. But, and not just at this point, of course, in history. We do not talk too much about Eastern European history. This is true, like in general, not just on Schwerpunkt. In a way, it's statistically obvious that there was less. It was just like in terms of documentary production, material evidence, there's less to document. It's striking, really, to compare some areas, especially of Western, Southwestern Europe, and, say, the Eastern European world. In a sense, it's even worse, actually, to look at the Islamic lands that are a bit sort of a puzzle to an extent that at least we have come to think, because of probably the overly emphasized sense of the Islamic Golden Age and this super civilization that actually was just mostly continuing, like on the accomplishments of the Hellenistic world, like the Byzantines, in later, let's say, the Byzantine and the Persian legacy. That at this point, Islam had, for specific religious, political reasons, always been more messed up, more unstable than Christendom in general. And it, as I say, there hadn't been great powers, great civilizations, with great development. That also should never be denied, actually, because some conservatives go as far as that. That's not correct, even in a conservative traditional perspective. But it's obvious that by the 13th century, especially after the Mongol invasion, but this was gradually true since, again, the 11th century, the general decay, the arrival of the Seljuk, etc., that the system was heavily deteriorated, right, stabilized. That's also how, say, the Crusades could happen, or even just the Mongol success, the destruction of Baghdad. It was a terrible tragedy in the history of mankind, indeed, for many reasons. In any case, one cannot look at this sort of more fringe areas and say, well, okay, these are basically as important as, no. Like, the West, by far, especially in the 13th century, overly exceeds any comparison. Like, just these places actually are depending in very consistent terms on the same West, on the same traffic, its industry, its markets. Again, if you go into the medieval trade or medieval economy playlist, you will find, and especially in the videos about the Italian, because these were, say, the Italian maritime republics were really the middlemen of this enormous trade, that makes you see how strong, like how strong was probably the Western upper hand in the trade balance. Something we were talking about the other day in the video about Sicily, that at this point in history, or slightly before already, was starting to export grain for Europe, but also for Tunisia, for Egypt, from the what had been in antiquity the granaries of Europe, actually. So that gives you a dimension of how, of course, also there is a non-deterministic world condition to begin with. This happened because people did things in these lands that allowed the system to expand. It didn't magically, I don't know, Sicily did not magically turn to be, say, more or less fertile than it was, nor in comparison to other systems, because telling the truth, 13th century is also the peak, if you want, of Byzantine civilization, say in absolute terms of material wealth. The same goes for the Islamic world as well. If you pick them as a whole, aside from the different levels of political, institutional compaction or stability, the Western growth is paralleled in a sense by China, by other systems. Just it is very unique in its characteristics, and this incredibly enhances its qualitative, other than also just quantitative output, right? When you look at the Ile-de-France during the 13th century, you look at it and say, oh my God, this is utterly insane. Like at this point, Europe was covered in 80 magnificent cathedrals, enormous buildings that we would end actually after the mid-14th century crisis take centuries to finish in Europe, for how massive they were, also for, say, pre-industrial, sometimes even industrial civilizations. This happened all in the Middle Ages, but it's massive surplus that, especially in the Ile-de-France, you can spot in the sand base and the incredibly fat soil that produced, in specific case, very peculiar material, as you know, that was used in Gothic architecture that had to reflect light, to be particularly polished, to make this a sort of huge, say, light skyscrapers. This was the sense pointing at God in its perfection, and especially in the Carpathian, this was expanding. Actually, the very concept had emerged, the Gothic inside had emerged in England, southern England. Of course, the Saxon part was historically more developed, but of course, booming in France and emanating from there in the Rhineland, into Italy, into Spain, and so, like specifically in the Ile-de-France, incarnating the most absolutely supreme and enormous mystique of the French imperial grandeur, the feudal productivity of this massive Atlantic plains loaded in people, in agricultural resources, manpower, labor force that would create the grandiose building of the French kingdom that was by far the biggest system. Other, like then, just the most advanced. Basically, the most advanced systems were France, Italy. That's the axis. That's the axis. By the way, today we don't talk about the fact that the one that is politically formed between Paris, eventually Avignon, but still like Rome, Florence, Naples. This is really a massive system stretching from the Channel to Greece, that is dominated by this massive French Papal Angevin wealth axis that exudes power at all levels, right? The scholastics, the statal development, bureaucracy, administration, financial practice, art, literature. It's utterly insane. This is the output, civilization of this system. The entire history of mankind is cosmically central, second only to the Roman Empire, right? There is a lot of bonds that are forming, as we've seen before, also dependence on the West in many ways. In Spain, for example, you see that after the Reconquista, after Las Navas, there are these vast territories populated by an Islamic majority that, however, are now governed by Latin authorities. And the Mudeyyars, lots of Muslims, lots of Jews concentrated in Spain. Similarly, things work in Romania, in Greece, where you have the Franks that rule over this mostly discontented Orthodox Christianity that, however, partially dislodges the Latins. And just at land, because of the survival of Byzantine ramp states such as Epirus or Nicaea that will allow like for actual military campaigns to gradually erode the Latin presence. As we've seen, the union of the churches is not really successful at the end of the day, albeit this area will be taken over by the Ottomans later, so that's part of that sort of fringe dimension that could have sort of been part of the West, and instead, had it worse in historical hindsight, right? So we were talking about it in the video about the Thessalonian army organization during the later Middle Ages, exactly pointing out how essentially the Greeks sabotaged like the Latins and allowed the Turks to take over at a point. We will today, as you understand, we're just browsing the general picture, so we'll at some point adequately address all these topics in sort of deeper way. We need again these videos because if one does not get the broader perspective, it's also difficult to give meaning to the more in-depth content. There was also this broader Western awareness about the rest of the world. I mean, great part of European identity, this is true not just for the Middle Ages, but also the modern era, comes in relation to the enemies of the system. The fact, for example, that the Mongols came about at some point did open, say, the Western mind to the awareness of a much wider world in a geographical sense, at least. So the existence of peoples and countries that up to that point were actually known, right? It's a myth that they weren't known, but of course were not taken into consideration until, of course, you have this monstrous hordes coming to devastate countries like Poland or Hungary. All right. We talked, however, about the fact that the Westerners sort of, withstood that and also began to toy actually with the idea of a Mongol alliance against Islam once the Mongol Empire objectively had stopped its expansion. We actually see a lot of Westerners, not just in the East, say in China, as for example, as converters, like when they fought to evangelize the locals. Christianity existed in those regions also before, but also as mercenaries, for example. The same Mongols of Persia did hire Frankish knights, Italian marines to fight in places like the Persian Gulf. We don't talk too much about them, but these things did exist. And the fact that this terrible war machine had to use sort of the Westerners, and that, even in terms of the we talk about this often, about this terrible idea of, it's more archetypal than anything, of missile weapons as being so difficult to beat, whatever. The Mongols succeeded not because they had bows, but because they used combined armed tactics like all peoples here. But when you look at even there the balance with Western tactics, you realize that, the same Mongols needed, Western crossbowmen for hire, because they were apparently more efficient than whatever they had in Persia, in the case of the Ilkhanate, at least. So these are interesting ideas. And of course, this is valid in a sense for the West in a broader sense. We looked at Allied bodyguards of the Mongol Chinese emperors at this time. I made a video about, actually a mini-series about the Yuans, say their army, their warfare, their military history in general, and we noticed pretty interesting things also in this function. There is, of course, a general view of the world that, as you know, is seen symbolically. What happened in 1243 with the Mongol invasion was in many ways the long anticipated, prophecy of Prester John. There is a deeper reflection on, let's say, on the universe, of the world, on people, on God, and it all happens at this time. It would be too long to just, again, address the issue in depth, but just remember that in 1492 Columbus was traveling west, not to simply discover whatever or let's say having any greater hope, but to actually join forces again with the Chinese emperors against Islam, right, nominally. And so that's the dimension, the sort of, even after centuries of modernization and secularization, that actually the West revolved around in a very traditional sense. There are some frontier areas. We see Hungary, for example, having Catholic Christians, Orthodox ones, Jews, Muslims, even pagans at some point. Now, when the Mongols arrived to ravage the countries, there were these nomads, refugees installed, right, settled properly by the Hungarian kings. So you have already, like, east of Germany, east of Italy. Again, that's the world that gets a bit more fragile, right? It gets a bit more, let's say, destabilized by such movements. It's interesting also to section Europe in this sort of more west, central, east, depending also whether you're talking geography or culture, whatever, and could make, you see, a video for each one of these points. We will likely, right? But it's important to see, also to stress where most of the resources lay, right? This is disproportional to a degree. You have France being the largest country in Europe. 1/4 of the Europeans at this point are Italian. You see, for example, England and Germany being actually Germany being quite, if anything, large system, and this, in a territorial sense, England was smaller, but you have the systems that have remained historically, let's say, a bit more on the fringe, especially in high medieval times, that are now not as wealthy or productive as Western, Southwestern Europe, but they rise in relative terms faster, right? There are lots of studies on the crop yields, whatever, that in many ways make things a bit more conjectural, but these countries, exactly because they had, and paradoxically because they had less resources, were sort of extending in a territorial sense more speedily, and necessitating more wealth, let's say, just to support the growing population that was starting to boom and needing space. Like if you wonder where the Ostzeitling came from, also the English hegemonic, say, renewed and inactable hegemonic imperial ambitions on the broader British Isles, like that's in part from this too. That's where the Scandinavians after the Viking era like bent their forces like towards the Baltic. There is a massive growth at so many levels, and lots of infighting for that matter as well, that toughens, however, the system. We see a lot of missionary activities, as we were saying before. The Franciscans, the Dominicans, other huge chapter, mostly internal, really, right? We should focus, because it's sort of fascinating, towards this Asian direction, because the Mongols allowed this to happen. This, if anything, they're it's necessary for them. Finally, there is no one bothering trade between China and Europe in between, which had historically been the entire issue of Rome, of the Hands, etc. But the Franciscan, we should focus mostly on the inner frontiers and the spiritual ones, right? The Franciscans and the Dominicans deserve so much recognition, not just because of their acceptance of being part of a broader effort to fight heresies in a very consistent sense, and from their respective sort of backgrounds of spiritual sensitivity and inclination. But they are also, as you know, a mean of the Roman Church to control better the urban communities, also to give them a greater level of literacy, to control the work of the same bishops. They really, the Franciscans and the Dominicans become some of the greatest, produce some of the greatest scholars of the era. And we're talking science. This was the case of Oxford, especially in England. But, I mean, again, this is the great century of scholastics, so the recovery of Aristotle, at least the acceptance of it, acceptation of it within, say, integrated with Platonism from the other side in the now organically universal worldview that required that sort of more scientific bias. The world was changing for sure. We'll talk more about the implication of scholastics. Some people criticize it because they said basically they reduced everything to some sort of mechanism, sort of almost hypothesizing liminally what people can do, whereas Neoplatonism, that had been at the basis of Latin Germanic spirituality since late antiquity, was sort of curbing the process. It's more just like the obvious consequence of a growth and an eventual stagnation, and there's really nothing wrong in what was the actual fusion of Platonism and Aristotelianism for the necessity of a world that had to remain framed like this, like what was, say, framed within this universal order that also survived, as you know, in the Aristotelian Ptolemaic system. The same universal authorities, at least functionality, you can argue. I mean, in the 14th century is definitely a shrinking in these powers, let's say, but European culture had been informed scientifically and morally in this great 13th century, say, cathedral-like built theory. You can read it even probably from the Gothic script and manuscript layout. This massively, broad and sort of, very well ordered and accessible. This is the most important thing: accessible information. Gothic manuscripts are written not just containing this enormous amount of information. Each are massive things. The libraries start being huge, etc. But because economy also is changing, like there is all an increased monetization, this fluidifies international relations, traffics, research. You start seeing sort of the germs of humanism already, but this already from a while. But these books are used. They must be accessible. They must be uniform. It's their knowledge, the contained knowledge, must be standardized. Must give certainty and a robust structure to the system. That's why the Gothic script in itself is narrow and thin, like a cathedral in itself. It must be functional and useful and really being conventionally used by a population of scholars that holds the system in a theological, juridical, cultural sense. It's a massive moral and scientific achievement. We see, again, traveling literature as well, as far as those Asian adventures are concerned. We talk about the work of John of Plano Carpini. That is a great military source. When Franciscans made military culture, right, describing the Mongol army is one of the best sources ever, also because we don't have too much from the Mongol side as well. The Westerners document an enormous amount of cultures that otherwise would have not documented themselves in this specific fashion. The Polos, the Polo brothers, but others. There are many travelers that really show us also how these people really saw the world. Right, there is Rubruk, there is again famous literary figures that we can't simply discuss again, unfortunately, today. The 13th century is also the great victory, moment of victory over the heretics, the infidels. This stems from, obviously, the accomplishment in the Reconquista. thanks to a renewed robustness of the Roman Church that, as we said before, manages to integrate the paparistic evangelical movements, and of which the Dominicans, the Franciscans, are the result of, the Cathars are destroyed. And this doesn't have to be given for granted at all, because heresies were still about to take over. In the beginning of the 13th century, the same Almohads were sort of making a coming back. At the end of the 12th, as you know, Jerusalem had fallen in the hands of the Ayyubids. So the system did seem, throughout all its wars and lack of regulation, at least to the point that civilization had not yet created that massive cathedral that we see, in fact, in the kingdom of Louis IX or in the Scholastic, etc., to hold the entire political, military, and social frame. Right? But the 13th century is a great victory and accomplishment in this regard. There was a great attention in this regard to the religious consciousness of the Catholics, because you cannot preserve the system if you ignore that, of course, the human nature is sinful and inclined to sin yet again. So there must be a discipline that regulates the entire picture. There are great names like the one of Raymond Lull. You see the activity of the various friars and the various orders and subgroups, the tertiaries, etc., that really work everywhere at the princely courts as well as in the city streets, and become part of this same institutional glue and political order. But by this point, the Muslims of Sicily are entirely expelled. Frederick II makes this last Ripulisti. Actually, he sends them in. Many had fled since the majority had fled since the Norman conquest in the 11th century. But there are the Saracens of Lucera. Many of these people, just like in Spain, were not even technically descendants, at least necessarily in a meaningful way, from the actual mostly Berbers that had come from North Africa. They were so local Sicilians in this case. They were brought to, because they were sort of leading also brigandage, etc. They were deported to the military colony of Lucera in Apulia that served, providing this pretty good troops for Frederick II's army. Eventually the Angevins used them a little, and then they exterminate them later on. So brutal stories, right? There are, at this point, lots of increasingly ruthless pressures to convert the Jewry, for example. There was the traditional point of the Jewry, and why such non-Christian belief was tolerated, is that in the end time, the Christians should have some witness to the fact that they were right, and so the Jews were to be preserved within Christian society. That's how they saw it. And so there was this traditional Augustinian guarantee that had always been a thing, allowing the Jews that lived in Europe since the times of the Roman Empire to be in a subordinate and discriminated condition, but still within Christian society. And it was actually a duty of the Christian authorities to protect them. In fact, what is often said is that the elites always protected them. The sense is that these revolts that were aiming at stealing the Jewish money that was basically collected just because the idea was that they could go to hell and so practice usury, even though there were ways Christians practice trade, banking ways. These Jews were particularly useful, especially in Central Europe, in countries like Poland, Bohemia, Germany, to create properly, like to be think about the offshoot of Vienna, as we've seen being an institutionalized figure even in our series for the 1683 siege. But in places like Hungary, etc., being able to provide with some financial resources that these countries were a bit looser, like in terms of central power concentration, could not grasp from their nobility that was eroding, in fact, the public authority and eventually making these states fail into some elective system. And in fact, that's exactly, like if you look at the dreaded history of anti-Judaism, especially in fact in Central and Eastern Europe, the place where this hatred towards the Jewry was harsher. Also for other reasons, like in countries like, I don't know, the Netherlands or Italy, Jews were also during the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, quite discriminated against, ghettoed, segregated, etc. But they were still in this Western context part of society, like they lived into the rest of the world. They were integrated in the cities, they were educated, etc. In Central Eastern Europe, they were instead probably marginated to a condition of misery that brought them to remain like so truly apart from the rest of society, without considering that many of these came from the East, right? The collapse of the Khazar Khaganate at the hands of the Kievan Rus had brought to this partly Judaized population to mostly to go in the closest, more developed place at hand. It was in fact Central Europe, and so that's how the thing actually began. The West had a slightly different story. The reason why the Jews were persecuted, we'll see it, for example, soon in the video about Edward I and massacred at some point, was just to this allogenity and the fact that the Jews had been allowed for these other professions that mirrored the sort of the day-side view, of course, of the Jews as the traitors of Christ, etc. And so this brought to justification for such violence, as you well know, through things like blood libel and charges of child murder, which had been particularly a thing, as you know, starting from the First Crusade, especially in places like the Rhineland, eventually consolidating in the mid-12th century, when the elites were also concentrated most power. So again, the conspiracy to that the Jewry was controlling the elites, and so it started even as early as that. And in vain, great and as enlightened rulers like Frederick II of Hohenstaufen and the Pope Innocent IV basically said that all these fabrications were devoid, of course, of any foundation, that these documents didn't have any value. It was just a way essentially to seize, very practically, very, very ruthlessly, the Jewish assets from the side of the local third estaters that at some point were cut to pieces by the same local bishops that gave shelter to the Jews during this veritable riots that were really devastating. And the Talmud was increasingly targeted as a proof of the alleged disdain Jews held for Christianity. Naturally, it's not like the Jews were, I don't know, in fact, thinking that the Christians wouldn't be the ones who would end up in hell. But, of course, like, we shouldn't understand, say, medieval coexistence of different cultures as, say, in the sense of tolerance that we know today, right? Today's sense of tolerance is that basically everybody has equal rights that must be recognized by law. At the time, tolerance was, if anything, just a very pragmatic sense of balance of different communities that could be sort of, in fact, used to make make leverage on one another for political reasons, and that's they coexisted, but they actually aided each other's guts to the extent, of course, also that a very long centuries or even millenary-old coexistence would be. I mean, some Jewish communities, for example, the one of Rome is one of the most ancient European ones, like in that you can track continuously. So they were part of the same world, and as we were pointing out before, also coming from different origins, from different geographical areas. The hatred towards the Jewry was also connected with the fact that many Jews had been more affiliated with the Muslims historically. This was particularly evident in the Iberian Peninsula. But there were lots of Jews that had always been within the Christian world and also like fighting in it against the Muslims, for that matter. It's sort of forgotten to an extent. But we'll make some perhaps historical military unit series about the medieval jury, because they did have some interesting contribution to such efforts. Plus, it was obvious that if Christianity expressed the truth, and so also societally in a reasonable way, that there was always the excuse of saying, why don't these people conform? And there were forced conversions, as you know, at some point. So that was the humanization of the Jews. Like there was some. This was extended to other groups as well. It was not just about the infidels, about the Muslims, for example, but for example, the same Greeks, right? Even though Christian, these were seen as not quite like others. Like this was true also in the Baltic. Like the Ruthenians were seen as competitors, as people that fought against them. So cutting them down was not much of a big deal. Not much because of the religious difference, but simply like the cultural context. Like somebody from Novgorod is not, just very culturally, say, contentable in a relation with Teutonic Knights in a general sense. Of course, there were Orthodox people living in southern Italy, for example, that were sort of, in that sense, more familiar in a way. But this otherness, in the sense that the Latins were inherently superior, basically, to all these other groups, was a pretty consistently affirmed, or tacitly affirmed, belief as reality, as a matter of fact. So all these groups were marginalized, and this also contributed to the assimilation of them in conditions of when they were in staunch minority. Not always, especially the Jews were very, as you know, very resilient in the continuation of their identity, of their beliefs, of their practice, their lifestyle, and because they had always been organized for that kind of survival, that kind of adaptation as well. That they weren't problematic subjects as this other also bigger groups really were. That was also an important discriminant. During the 13th century, heresy, as we pointed out, had been a huge deal. The Cathars, however, put down. There was the issue of the Valdensians. We talked about it yesterday in the video about the heresies, and that were sort of more, they were closer to the Church of Rome, and even accepting the extermination of the Cathars for that matter. There were other more heterodox groups that sometimes were eventually institutionalized. I made a video, for example, about the Humiliati, the Beguines. There is quite a world of heterodoxy that was necessary to be integrated, civilly speaking, and so gradually assimilated, like smoothened, and so on. The Albigensian Crusade is just the peak, the most escalational evidence of the great, relentless, rigorous investigation and effort conducted by the inquisitors in southern France, Germany, and Italy. These ideas had spread very often among the third estate of some of the most developed places. In Europe, the Rhineland, Lombardy, the same cities of southern France. As you know, Catharism had a long story. It mostly spread from the east, the Paulicians, then the Bogomils in the Balkans, from places like Serbia, etc. Eventually had flourished in a sort of hypocritically, what today would be called anti-capitalistic, even though the term capitalism was just invented by the communists to indicate essentially the people that they want to steal the money from. And it appealed to the third estaters because during the 13th century, the previous ones, they had reached unprecedented levels of material wealth, and this created them moral issues and excesses and so on. And of course, there were the fourth estaters as useful idiots and violent rustics and brigands, etc. Think about the Brabant and so that would embrace these ideas, even though they didn't care very much about the theology of it, just to make violence, or attempted some sort of revolt, guided by third estaters, or even noblemen for that matter. But civilizationally, Western Christendom managed, with a very, very successful, very intelligent, very, very well organized cooperation between the lay and the ecclesiastical authorities all over the West to win the heresies. And this is, like, you don't quite have the means of, coercion that you can find, I don't know, in a totalitarian 20th century state. All right, so think about doing so in the 13th century. I mean, the church had won the investiture controversy, at least on a to some regional level, in 1122. The Gregorian reforms, the idea of the papal monarchy, so sort of a territorial state as well, were pretty novel. So it's not like the papacy could simply send soldiers around the world trying to infringe also on the local seigneurial or even episcopal rights for that matter. So the victory against the Cathars was actually the victory of the decisive moral majority of Westerners over these movements that, as we've seen from communism to veganism, were not exactly the best solution for also a problem that technically did not exist, but was invented just to try to exaggerate constituted power rather than making any relevant religious or spiritual point. And if anything, there was one that stemmed from the weakness of individuals, couldn't quite handle the power that they were provided with. And I explained all this yesterday in the video about the pacifism as a heresy. And so, really, in a marvelous way, in the 13th century, Catharism was nearly eradicated. Surely it survived, because you couldn't literally delete it completely, but it did so in the very fringe of the world, like in remote villages, and just mostly for the 14th century. Yes, there were some sort of dualistic beliefs remaining. These were part just of the inherent issues of philosophy and sort of worldviews and societal political roles. You have corners of Europe, such as Montaillou in the Pyrenees, that represent this Catholic community's survival. The Dominican in this had made really a great job. However, there was some heterodoxy persisting within the same church itself. I made a video about, it's titled on the conflict or the struggle over Francis' legacy. We should make more videos on St. Francis. And the scandal that occurred among the spiritual wing of the Franciscans that basically were denounced at the same Studium of Paris for it. The church had to intervene. There was a damnatio memoriae of the very issues that had arisen in this extremistic advocacy for the necessity of absolute poverty, but mostly like the theological implications that came with that, some of which were openly heretical and actually pretty disturbing in a sense, as if the spirituals were the most altruistic fringe within the Franciscan movement, the ones that thought at least that Francis' original spirit had been betrayed. Also, the later rule of the saint had been adapted to the church's demands in a way that some early followers of Francis had not accepted. And so this mostly, again, a radical fringe had hidden right within the same system. The Franciscans had always been the more heterodox, and eventually were, especially after this, under the generalship of Saint Bonaventure, were properly reorganized and redisciplined as on the model of the Dominicans. And the reason why the spirituals had been so pernicious, aside from the infiltration in the highest levels also of theological school, and the Sorbonne was really the capital of theological studies in Europe, was that there was a link to the broader critique of societal commercialization that had been rising since the late 12th century. So again, the paupieristic evangelical movements had stemmed from this. And the theme had been also a significant part of Francis of Assisi's ministry itself, but not reaching the levels of criticism of the church and denial, in fact, of the righteousness of the essentially devilish nature of the church that was expressed by some of these individuals that really cultivated this thoughts and scriptures even within the same current. But again, there's an entire video that deals with the matter. This was quite an important issue for the church, because the Franciscans were really brought even more, and exactly because of their original heterodoxy, brought in the palm of the hand as the greatest symbol of the success of the paupieristic evangelical integration in the Roman Church. So the stain of this was the stain on the church entire, and it had to be cancelled entirely, so that a major censorship and destruction of the very sources of this issue was carried out. There were other, however, works aiming at dealing with the problems that this increasing materialism was bringing in society. For example, how to treat usurers, right? How to define usury in the first place. You have great figures as Ramon de Peñafort, that, as you know, served as the Dominican general for a period, and the St. Thomas Aquinas. And so the church was mitigating the spiritual needs of Christians as the legitimate aspirations that would not contradict church doctrine. And so the idea that an imperial Catholic achievement works were important was at the root of this all, that wealth was not a crime per se. It was how you let yourself being corrupted by it if you're weak, right? Wealth is amorphous. It doesn't have a life. Even if it has a power, it's not something that it's something that still comes from you. You're fully responsible for, that only your soul decides whether to give or not. During the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, the text of the Creed was presented, by the way, both in both Latin and Greek, to accommodate at that point the requirements of the Uniate Church that, as we've seen, existed because of the recently acquired Latin Empire, but also again some sympathies that were shown in the Ruthenian Palatinate. Galicia, Volhynia made a bit about that principality, by the way, that really with the Mongols incoming was starting to feel a pressure that also the one from St. Paul's, so the Hungarians, a bit later on during the century especially, but still considering the general destabilization that region was undergoing even before the arrival of the Mongols. The church stressed that secular rulers, including the Counts of Toulouse and Frederick II, had a responsibility to actively fight heresy. Usury was often a concern for enthusiastic princes like Louis IX of France, that naturally was expressing some of the most rigoristic northern French imperial mystique model that of a pure nobility that did not involve itself with the richness as wealth, as if not as something redistributed. Naturally, the French monarchy was incredibly lavish, but Saint Louis IX was a great moderate ruler. He also sort of once helped some monks carrying water in front of his following that was so ashamed of themselves that they dismounted from their horses and began to help the king in that sense. There are so many different, in parallel with enormous military feats, by the way. So the sense of monastic doctrination, also in a military sense, for making the Catholic power exploding imperially outside in the world in a knightly fashion, was something practiced. It's the peak, right, of the, as you know, of the monastic chivalric orders as well. In Spain, in the Baltic, we made some video about that already. In spite of this massive accomplishments, of course, the challenges for the church as well for other rulers was not over, right? Heresy itself and all this, say, perturbance within the new order, like the same further affirmation on a truly continental scale of the papal monarchy, brought once again to the forefront the complex issue of papal authority, and so in particular its ability to direct lay rulers, which, as you know, brought to the most clamorous confrontation with Frederick II that we covered very often at the end of the 13th century, also the one with Philip IV. The wars with Frederick II were incredibly pernicious, especially in the 30s, in the 40s. However, the peak of also medieval propaganda system and effectiveness that unfortunately is not complete to us due to the fact that most of it was still oral, as you understand. It really reaches the peak under Manfred of Sicily, the legitimate son of Frederick II and ruler of, in fact, of the Southern Italian kingdom. And that is also the moment of greater polarization between the Ghibelline and the Guelph ideology. That's really when it exploded, right? It wasn't, say, under Frederick Barbarossa and the actual struggle between the Welfen and the Hohenstaufen in Germany during the second half of the 12th century. It really magnified in the 13th century this also new means. It's as if in proportion at the time, I don't know, the internet has spread, like just we experience, and so the thing escalated to an unprecedented level because of all the sort of material wealth, again, monetization, commercialization, the further growth of urban culture, and so an unprecedented level of power leverage compared to before, and also societal complexity that made politics playing at so many different levels. Think about, in fact, the same Dominicans and Franciscans as a mean of control, say bishops sometimes were properly connected with the Ghibelline codes as a reaction. There is properly a real declaration, both from the side of Philip IV and Boniface VIII, of imperial authority from both of them. Boniface VIII said, "I'm Caesar," right, and that's how it had to be. Consider at this point the German imperial power had been reduced to pretty, modest thing in comparison, say, to the French one. So I made a video explaining the imperial essence of the French monarchy, not just by the fact that it was the greatest power in Europe at this point, but way before, let's say, were in part, let's say, the Western Franks exactly as an offspring of the Carolingian imperial power had sort of matured its authority models from. And that brought on the fore, in a sense, the paradox of the fact that still the real traditional vibe concerning the actual divinity of every form of earthly power, right? So the fact that just the papacy had a territorial state, the fact that, you see, there was an empire had sort of gone under, and a Philip IV could meet as a young leader, after all, the old veteran Rudolf of Habsburg that salvaged part of its, if anything, of his own possessions within the empire, in the name, however, of a Roman revival of an imperial authority. At the border between France and Germany, was really showing how much of a giant France was at this point, how complicated situations were for the Germans. So, needless to say, I don't want to say every time that I made videos on this, but just be aware, it's a little reminder. I don't have sponsors on Schwerpunkt, so I just use this sort of little reminder. I don't have stickers, I don't have anything that sort of reminds you consistently, so that there is something out there that I already made, but as you know, we looked at 13th century German history, and we must do it much more, right? If we want to really understand this all, the same goes for the French one, the Papal one, etc. But what I would like to stress, and I often discuss this, especially in the videos about the investiture controversy, the Gregorian reforms, but this is valid also for the 13th century as a follow-up. Civilization is also made successfully by propaganda efforts. The skills of the rhetoricians, for example. I made a video about the Italian communes that shows you how without rhetoric, the city could not exist, some said. Like, properly there is no rule, right, they said. And the Italians were on the forefront of that skill, also for proper civic, practice and, also juridical exercise within this, the actual city-states now, without mentioning the fact that they were the center of the most important universities that were at this point really flowering themselves as yet another crucially developed and sort of unprecedented in this sense cradle of in part of, say, if not of leadership, at least juridical doctors were knighted literally, and they were paid an enormity just for their consultancy in the public, the seas of public power. But let's say the university itself is a demonstration of the need of this skill, the fact that such huge forces that were agitating politics and war and society needed to be regulated, needed to be studied, needed to be disciplined. And so, as I was saying before, like the output of manuscripts that exist at this point, the level of civic education and of polymathism as well. Dante is born in 1265, so it's not like we're talking about just abstract concepts. There are veritable figures like the voice of medieval civilization really passed through this very finest of the civilizational development. Think about the spread of Roman law, the fact that the civil law would be gradually spread all over Europe as the actual common law, like the one that could fix the gaps in the local customs, and that could be sort of more reliable point of reference for societies, by the way, that in order to recover Roman law had already reached a very high level of juridical development. This was the case for, in fact, the Bolognese studium as a part of the Italic kingdom had a massive, let's say, for example, commercial development, had more monetization, had more sort of social mobility, at least in terms of really per capita wealth. It was the highest in the world. It had greater literacy. It had bigger cities. It was so central in, as we've seen, Mediterranean trade, so needed somebody regulating it as a broader world. And so the fact that this Roman law was obviously during the Ghibelline effort recovered by Frederick Barbarossa as also mirroring essentially what was in the reconstruction of the Justinian Code by these Italian philologists and lawyers, the let's say the reflecting the Theodosian rather than also the Justinian, it was just a fixing of it, basically development of it, idea that the emperor is to rule over the church, for example, according to the Constantinian model, at least prevailed in the Byzantine Empire, that instead in the West went in a very different direction. And also, in my opinion, exactly for what we're just talking about here, as a consequence of the investiture controversy, very far something that would actually damage the system, right? We've seen it many times, the emperor and the papacy gave each other a tough time, it wasn't because they were not recognizing each other. As a matter of fact, we're actually backing each other, and it would also routinely cooperate, also very successfully at some point, which may seem paradoxical, but this is exactly what a real civilization is fueled by, right? Healthy competition and a capacity to test each other's boundaries to grow in the process. This is really, as a civilizational spin-off, like an enormous accomplishment that we often don't see. Also because we prefer to see just the scenographic side of the story, battles, sieges, tournaments. That's a great deal of thing. It really incarnates the models of honor, of fealty, of chivalry at so many levels, next to sort of the more communal dimension still framed within the organic hierarchy. But all these wars, all this force displayed was out there because of the inherent efforts within the Saint Christendom to regulate this system in a way that is really unprecedented in the history of mankind when you understand how homogeneous Western culture really already was at this point. This is the entire point of our Middle Ages, that compared to other parts of the world, does not display some sort of, in China, some more or less centralistic bureaucracy, even when it is actually developed here. You see, modern bureaucracy is truly born between Rome, Avignon, and Paris in this time, between the 13th and 14th century. But this was not to supersede feudalism, right? It would take at least 600 years before that happened, and also for reasons that were going plainly against the same authorities that were creating this at the time. This was to stiffen the same feudal system, and it had and all the communities, including the communes, the city-states that had developed within it, because of the organic nature of the universal rule, the fact that all Western Christendom, at least the Latin, Frankish, Western world, was necessitated in order to do even more than it was actually doing. As we've seen, it was pretty impressive. So there are huge issues at stake, like entire chunks of Europe that are sort of debated as far as, for example, whether Sicily was part of the Holy Roman Empire or not. I mean, at least it never was, but the Hohenstaufen were playing this sort of dual role from the moment in which they inherited it from the Hauteville, the last heirs, to the Hauteville fortune. And how do you just think about that issue? It's not just like, the Pope or the Emperor sitting on their chairs and thinking, oh my God, is it part of the Holy Roman Empire or not? No, these people were wrestling over it with not just armies invading each other's territory, but very ranks of jurists, of theologians, of rhetoricians, spies, people who spread news, and all kind of civilizational weapons that were obviously developing as a muscle in the moment. There's a great assertivity by the side of the papacy that illustrates how veritably powerful the system, as I said before, even though not really being a major regional force, really the Pope ruled over a provincial dimension, but how, strongly supported it was all over Europe to create this struggle, this conflict between, generally speaking, two opposite, I wouldn't call them blocks because they weren't really blocks, but still two visions, two takes, multi-layered takes on, in fact, different issues that are not even simply, again, the papacy or its specific vision and the empire's specific vision. They were quite hybrid in many ways, right? As we've seen, there was an imperial dimension of papal states in this, as much as a divine, sort of almost hierarchical dimension of the same emperors. And so this was all traditional in some ways, and it was about the old struggle between, the priesthood and warriorhood, but in order to really test which one was, say, at least because of the broader decline of the supreme force that was the empire, could not now be in control of the church that simply in the gradual degeneration of mankind, for how like the separation of state and church had happened since Christian times, just out of the consequence that Roman emperors at some point cannot hold divine power, cannot have at least but a fraction of what is needed to control the world, and so a unitary empire, to the point that the church says, okay, we have to rise to be the guarantors of some spiritual standards that we want to see in the emperor so that he can rule. And so from there, as you know, lots of issues, and the emperors would have wanted to simply regain that sort of control, even though even this control is, as you can see in the Byzantine case, not a very successful model at all, right? The system would sort of sclerotize because of that. As I said, investiture controversy was a blessing for Western civilization because it worked as it should have worked, as a power tension that developed further the system from the within. And again, the comparison with Orthodoxy, for example, under everybody's eyes. At this point, the broader Orthodox world was essentially failed. It was a failed state because of the Latin conquest, because of the Mongol conquest, while the West was literally booming. You can argue that the great object of contention had remained Rome, right? Rome was not just a massive, again, civilizational engine for all the West. There wasn't a more largely influential center at this point. Still, historically, even though Rome wasn't by no means the largest city in the West, as it passed to Milan, to Paris, but and this is not just about the Germans, the main object of contention remained definitely the Italian peninsula, united, and especially during the 13th century. You know, not just what happened under Frederick II, but also with Manfred, with Charles of Anjou, with Conradin, and with the affirmation of the aforementioned French, Welf, Papal, Angevin axis that finally sort of managed by the end of the century to hegemonize even central northern Italy, at least in a political, sense of political alignment. The Ghibellines did not disappear. There were some cities that were ruled by them, but this was like an enormously smooth, also trade space that is often underappreciated. Like the money that was being made at this point was, especially in central northern Italy, was utterly insane, to say the least. For not talking about war and more. The apocalyptic depictions of Frederick as the Antichrist held both propaganda value and reflected deeply held beliefs among certain factions close to the Pope. The wars against the Lombard League had naturally caused from the Welsh side like the true belief that there was an Antichrist, a mighty force that was understood exactly as a universal one here in Frederick. Think about the same Joachimites, right, that were very close to the aforementioned current of the spirituals that had literally a prophecy seen in Frederick the Antichrist. And there is a friar from Parma, Saint Bennett, by the way, lived through all these terrible wars like in northern Italy, etc., that, and is also the author of a very famous chronicle that, in fact, tells us that he had actually believed that Frederick was the Antichrist, but he had this friar had the intellectual honesty of saying, you know what, we were wrong because the war went on. The end time did not arrive. But people truly lived in this sense of in the awareness of the greatness of such universal dimension, and truly believed that a figure like Frederick II could truly be the one, because to them, after all, all this massive development that had taken place in the last generation was as tumultuously dazzling to look at this unprecedented power and say, this is really the deal. This is this is the devil himself, his enormous force. And we'll talk more about Frederick II because also his army deserves sort of a grade of attention. Let's not even talk about the propaganda involved in Philip IV's defamation of Boniface VIII and the Knights Templar, for example. You understand there how radical certain moves really were, just to keep, by the way, a gigantic, a leviathanic system like France afloat, because under Louis IX you had the affirmation of a first order, a feudal hierarchy. By Philip IV's time, and I made a video explaining how the French monarchy evolved at that point, that was not satisfactory anymore. Right? It wasn't just about fealty, homage, or whatever. Already at that time actually was sort of a very different thing. But at least among the oligarchs, it had established itself. Now that was not enough, right? You had to create some more central powers, involving also the third estate. So you had this largely also anti-traditional attacks, like the idea behind the Templars being that they had sort of been rediscovering that aforementioned Ghibelline sense of, and the monastic chivalric orders were very much siding Frederick II and helping him, just because they thought also that they could be saved by him in the Holy Land by a new crusade, a new expedition of the emperor, because they saw likely the possibility of reacquiring properly a union between sacerdotal and imperial power that were cultivating by themselves in their military training, their ascetic practice, and probably a lot of occult knowledge that the church naturally did not want, wouldn't allow to, for obvious reasons, let's say, of competitively, but also because in part it was really beyond the official doctrine of the church, and in some sense probably also in a not necessarily fully traditional way, but God knows really just what really happened there. And we should also consider one aspect in this, that this is also the great question to begin with, like, when is that the empire had really reached its peak in relative terms, not in absolute terms? Like, evidently this is the second half of the 12th century. That's where Germany was really the first power in Europe, all right? Aside from taking parallel with the Byzantine Empire, there were other powerful contenders, like it was France, it was Sicily, not to be get with, but let's say under Frederick II, was there really the possibility to reduce the papacy to the status of an imperial chaplaincy like it had happened during Ottonian times, and not even so successful in the end? Really not, right? It's not really to be believed. We believe so because also the papal propaganda sort of won. Frederick had his insidious propaganda as well. They were all using the same means. Actually, propaganda was pretty standard at the time in terms of the content. Frederick was an heretic, the Pope was the devil, depending on how, or vice versa, or both at the same time for both. There were very specific offenses. There are people who think, I don't know, that some people were homosexual at the time because in the propaganda they read, this guy was a sodomite. A sodomite was a normal accusation of some sort of general misconduct that had nothing to do with the historicity or the accuracy or even the will at the time to think that this person was a sexually deviant individual to begin with. So that's it's very interesting to study medieval propaganda, I must say, and we should actually make a video sooner or later on that. But there is also no doubt in the bigger scale that as long as the Hohenstaufen controlled Germany and Sicily, especially, they tried to control Italy, and that was only partially successful. There was Burgundy, technically. There was also Bohemia in a more distant sense. There was also Jerusalem, for that matter, that Frederick had temporarily recovered, but also just with a pact with the Egyptians, really. that also angered the Pope, because also every excuse was good to attack Frederick. But there is no doubt that the Hohenstaufen levied an enormous power themselves, and that Rome, being in between, felt a bit choked by his pressure, and then Frederick, of course, would have been happy to simply have the upper hand in the issue. And as you know, just like for his grandfather and namesake Frederick, there is an enormous set of legions that we will see sooner or later regarding properly the fact that, you see, under Frederick, the term Sol Invictus is lastly used. It may be a chance that we last see the Draco in Europe used, the Draco banner used in 13th century Germany. There is some vestige of the past, some very high idea of Romanity that Frederick looks up to and wants to incarnate, and that, of course, in the imperial Catholic tradition has an unequivocal meaning, also in relation with the Church. And so this opens to an obvious struggle that couldn't but, see each side beating themselves down. After that, actually, the papacy keeps being more open, actually, with the emperors. As long as they stayed in Germany, it wasn't much of a problem for a while. It would, again, during the modern era, for example, being best friends around. What else could we say? There was also a facilitation for the West to consider the reaffirmation of the empire in a broader sense. That was exactly in those years the fall of Constantinople. From 1204 to 1261, there was no such thing like a Byzantine Empire, right? There were these rump states we were talking about before. There was the Latin Empire that sort of started even well, but was beaten by the Bulgarians. So basically the knightly manpower of this Latin dominion was sort of thwarted, and it's just the Byzantine weakness that takes so long for another half of a century Constantinople to remain into the Latin hands. By the way, as you know, Constantinople was taken with a coup, not even with a siege by the Palaiologoi back. So it's sort of weird history that tells you also how sort of relatively uninterested the Westerners were towards this other non-Western lands. Not that they were isolated, as we've seen. They wanted to expand, but Europe, Western Europe in itself, presented so many opportunities more than this sort of very different world. Like, we should at some point stress how somehow distant really Byzantine culture had become even to the West, even though the Westerners had sensibly influenced it in the previous centuries, and sort of vice versa, of course, even before. But getting the worst of it later, the more time passed from the Byzantine side. But there was no other emperor out there. So given that Constantinople was ruled by a Latin patriarch, there was really no limit, apparently, to the ambition of a man like Frederick II, who could simply claim to be the sole emperor in Europe. Have you ever thought about this? Because, of course, the Byzantine rump states sort of maintained the idea of, say, the imperial titles for themselves, even before they retook Constantinople, etc. But, again, from a Western perspective, it was all easier as far as that issue had been concerned. The Byzantines had been quite insidious, even in a strategic sense. I mean, under Manuel Comnenus at the end of the 12th century, the Siculo-Normans were about to be wiped out by a Byzantine invasion. It wasn't like, I don't know, a little power. It was a major regional force that had also threatened back in the day, as we've seen in the video about the Battle of Dyrrhachium, that the same existence of the Byzantine Empire, by far the worst threat to it. I mean, the Seljuks are nothing in comparison. You really fear those Normans if you live in Greece. We definitely see already in Frederick's times process of nationalization and regionalization of power. Without digressing on German history, because we will see it much better detail, but as you know, after Frederick's son rebellion, backed by the German princes, Frederick was in fact to create literally an edict in their favor, the Edictum in Favorem Principum, around 1237, that basically was starting to sell public rights in the empire. And Frederick's great dream would have been, as many Central European princes, by the way, to first of all incorporate the Babenberg fortune in southeastern Germany. This Austrian house, as you know, was capable of creating an incredibly tidy, rich, powerful dominion in that region, and now it was extinguished, and so eventually it was the Habsburgs, the Bohemians, the Hungarians who would battle over it. But the idea was to essentially just concentrate all power in Swabia and in Austria, so basically to cover the almost the entire Alpine arc, so that Italy would be sort of enclosed more or less in the north, and ruling still from Sicily, or hopefully for Rome, if that was to happen in the first place, and even reducing Germany in that sense to sort of secondary province. The Romanity of the empire was not really an option for anyone. This was also the great problem for 19th century German nationalists, as historiographically in the age of Romanticism, of the recovery of a more sort of regionally national and sort of, say, ethnically based, but in that sense only German-based worldview. Frederick's, as the Hohenstaufens in general, ambition in the Mediterranean seemed like just a chimera, where the Germans should have done what Henry Lion had done, that is to say, expanding in the Baltic, expanding in the east, like the Germans of those times, the 20th century would have really done. But Frederick, of course, would prefer like a much more robust and especially better administered kingdom, like the one of Sicily, that would really provide, at least as a whole, like more easily, like the resources needed to carry out some broader, also Mediterranean policies, so to make leverage in places that could get you more. That's why, for example, by imitating the aforementioned legal scholars in Bologna, Frederick founds the University of Naples. I made a video on the Studium Neapolitanum. That was exactly to show that sort of need for legal, juridical, administrative personnel for the compaction of a power, a more defined territorial basis. This aside, it's useless to reason with what ifs, but in perspective, what we were looking at in Angevin times that were also much more disorderly ones in a general sense, with the loss of Sicily, etc., was being done successfully, bureaucratically, and Frederick had already sort of envisaged it as a very enlightened ruler to begin with. And naturally, these universities were themselves a center of ideological fostering, as, for example, the justification of the authority of the princeps was concerned. We can see very similar works in England under Edward I, in Spain under Alfonso X of Castile, and in the same France of Philip IV, Philip the Fair. Right? The address, the tendency is basically always the same. This is really the phase of the peak of the great feudal monarchies, and now you need, as a further step, a more statal, more central consolidation to hold this otherwise sort of privately the perishable system. Canon law was also modified, by the way. Remember that the lay and ecclesiastical authority goes in parallel here. They're not two separated worlds. They go really, not really hand in hand, because very often they were countering one another in that vestige of controversy and the general Guelph-Ghibelline struggle. But we're talking about the same people. Also the laymen now are really at the center also of the ecclesiastical skilled personnel. This was already the case for a very long time, but especially in places like the Italian peninsula, as we were saying before, was really the norm. Rulers were increasingly recognized as kings of specific territories. You see the prelude to the national monarchic, affirmation, also on the rather than the one of the universal authorities, right? The dream of a mega empire basically had already long faded, right? Even if the Hohenstaufen had truly managed to control Germany, Italy, Sicily, even just without the Pope, maybe, let's say, that would have been an insane feat, but could they simply control, I don't know, Spain, France, or England, or Poland, or Hungary? Of course, power is not to be measured geopolitically, meaning that boundaries are just a convention, and all these powers were mutually, interfering with one another in so many ways. We know how complicated politics is, not just in the Middle Ages, but the Middle Ages are a bit more educational, because there is really no modern state as we intended it, so we see a lot of much better of that shading, that infiltration that still exists today, with a much stronger central power. And you see this really even in the official titling. Famously enough, under Philip II Augustus, you have the shift from king of the Western Franks to literally king of France, and even in French, right? Not Rex France, only in the official titling, but also at so many levels in the bureaucracy. Roi de France, for the Royaume de France. Before it was Rex Francorum. The same happens in England. Rex Anglia is shifting towards Rex Anglorum. You notice here that the shift is not just from a way of saying or another, but literally from the king of this people to the king of this land. This passage is crucial in the secularization and modernization of thought, distancing of tradition, is to say, now it's easier to control people, actually. And also because these people, of course, want these regimes, but they have also largely deputed part of their liberty in the process of sort of obtaining more stability through it. If you look at the official titling in my series about the Anglo-Saxon polities, you realize that these were all king of the Kentish, king of the Saxon, of the merchants and so on. Now it was changing. Really, the 13th century is this turning point. As we were just saying, for France, in some kingdoms, the growing use of the vernacular in public documents like law codes contributed to a bourgeois sense of nationhood. Even if this awareness did not precisely coincide with the political boundaries, which is to be always borne in mind. It's obvious that Occitania, for example, was not particularly happy to have been brought under what was the pertinence since Carolingian times of the Western Frankish kings, because Languedoc and Languedoc are a bit different things. We've seen how during the Ostsiedlung the same German or Slavic identity sometimes mixed. The same goes for the Baltic or other areas. This is a departure from the sacrality of Latin, for example. Naturally, there are some countries in Europe that are more, distant, of course, from the Romance world, and so in part also historically, perspectively, from literacy altogether, right? So in these countries, the vernacular had been used just from older times in more, spheres of public life. naturally. Some areas were remaining a bit more, traditional in this. For example, Germany was very sticking to Latin in many ways, but say, for example, England or France were feeling this more nationally enucleated. And this is very important because it shows you the prodromes of what we've seen very often also for the modern era, say this Central European world being a bit more traditional than the West, as it sort of develops further towards some sort of more increasingly secular and modern direction on a national basis rather than a universal one. Obviously, in countries like Italy instead, vernacular takes more time to not to develop, because it was actually a much more mature language, but it was in its complexity and more, for obvious reasons that we listed before, but it was for this reason also easier to write in Latin, and so to do so, for example, in the public sphere, and still having a language we use every day in parallel, that only later, at this point, towards the end of say, begins to be a veritable literary language. Tout court, right? Old French, Old German had already been from quite a while. You see, even the identities being mixed. Very often, the Germans, for example, in the 13th century, start calling themselves Romans. Right? This was naturally pertaining more to the royal imperial role, Reges Romanorum. If they didn't become properly emperors, they would maintain, as you know, this title for the eligibility for papal crowning as Roman emperor, so that there is, even in terms of institution, as we've seen, some ambiguity, especially during the interregnum when things were decaying, becoming that blurred. But also militarily, for example, the German knighthood took on its Romanity. The war cry of the German knights, we're talking Austrians, Swabians, at the Battle of Markfeld in 1278 under Rudolf of Augsburg against Ottokar II of Bohemia, was "Here's Rome," right? The Romanity, the feudality had by far superseded that sort of more primitive tribal sense of it that, for example, the Bohemians, if you look at the sources of the same battle, still had in many ways, in spite of the fact that the ruler was pretty Germanized and dealing with the Germans all the time, as Bohemia, generally speaking, it really was. So there are divides in Europe, there are differences, there are important, in fact, qualities that are, however, all organically framed. You see a lot of power shifting, for example, from a region to another, like as we've seen, a relative, like for contemporary times, of course, a very unstable system, even though we can appreciate, as we said before, for the 13th century, rather, its effervescence and not its sclerosis. The fact that this was not an anarchic, chaotic reality. It was actually a pretty orderly and sensible, sum of incredibly strong forces that were, as we were just saying, politically territorializing ever more and seeking, in fact, an ever greater stability that already existed largely on a national basis of these dominions, etc. We see, for this very reason, veritable capitals developing. Paris, at this point, truly becomes the capital, or at least it de facto is, even though the French kings at some point would not really live there. During also the most turbulent times, Paris was sort of a dangerous place to be in, at least during some of the greatest struggles, especially during the 100 Years' War and so on. Westminster. Always remember that London is a much older and proper capital with proper chancery, etc., than Paris, right? England is admittedly smaller, but it's also compact and sort of more civilly oriented to some especially in its Anglo-Saxon substratum, in concentrating to Westminster, probably the bureaucratic center of the country. Naples, too. Naples has a hell of a, especially under the Angevins, of development as a veritable capital, which is all reflected also by the grandiose, glorious monuments that the ruling dynasties erect in such places. The Sainte-Chapelle in France, Westminster Abbey in London, and Santa Chiara in Naples. This is really the sort of most important, some of the most important locations. Of course, Rome, you have at this point great center like the St. Toledo, by the way. There are important. We think about the Cathedral of Cologne. I inserted some pictures of that. That's massive, but it was the see of an archbishopric, the most important in Germany. Cologne was the largest city in Germany. And in a video made on Cologne, actually this is the moment in which the burghers of Cologne expelled the bishop, that however controls really a vast seigneury all around the city that really can't do anything against it. And of course the bishop enters Cologne still, but it has to negotiate it because this center is becoming that important. I mean, of course the cathedral was largely destroyed during World War II, but it's one of the most beautiful pieces of art in the history of mankind. And there is so much in so many monuments are so iconic. At the Naumburg Cathedral, the sculptures of the like Bamberg's Rider. I mean, these are pieces of art that just express an entire civilization alone. I mean, Bamberg's Rider, looking at his gaze at the world and showing this confidence, this reborn world of the Germany that is Gothically emerging from the more forest, sort of primitive Romanesque style that really the country had been up to the last century. And this source of life and of morality springing out there and dominating the world from his horseback is something so linear, so simple, so spiritual, so mystical in itself. It's incredible, really. So what else could we say? There was some new attention for this very reason on the sanctity of the rulers. Sometimes there are so many examples of piety, of stories, legends. Think about Rudolf of Habsburg that put an end to the German interregnum, that according to the story was hunting just in Swabia as an affluent southern German count, and there is he's by a stream, a river basically, and a priest arrives with the Eucharist, and he arrives at the river and he has to cross it, but there is no crossing. And so Rudolf asks what he's there for, and says he has to bring the Eucharist for the last sacraments to a dying man. And so Rudolf hands the horse to the priest that eventually comes back and after his office and crosses the river and comes back to his parish and gives the horse back to Rudolf, that refuses because he said, "I will not ride a horse that has carried my own lord on it." I mean, these are some of the pieces of like 13th century history, and I actually want to see how many videos are made, because some of these stories are. We must talk more about history. There's no way around it. I'm really glad to talk about so many things with you, but in fact there are so many more that makes me feel as if I was always saying so few. 13th century history. How many videos? How many? And 113, and we're doing, there even really too few. Or you should make much more. No, don't open. YouTube does everything desperately to make you click on videos and watching ads, because that's the only thing they legitimately care about. Okay, but this is getting too much. I will not let you waste time. But I mean, sanctity. Think about Saint Louis, as you were saying before. Like, these are great figures beyond their merely secular reality. They really believed, as the people of the time, there was a higher transcendental duty that metaphysically had to inform the world through just their action. That's what they care so much. Even that in the later Middle Ages, there is, if you've read Kantorowicz, The King's Two Bodies, you know of the apostatization eventually of the kingly figure, so that the office becomes more important than the man, which wasn't quite the traditional view, right? A Philip IV would apparently be completely emotionless in public, which actually makes me think for rather many reasons that I dramatically resemble him. And the reason being that like, just in the first mover, the unmoved mover, like in Thomas Aquinas, say Aristotle, and the scholastics, the concept was being expressed. This is perfection. It's the doctrine of the two natures applied to of course, the higher level that the ruler has to be, and of course one that just inspires through his presence, doesn't even need to act or to speak or whatever. And who knows what kind of person he really was, right? We don't know even exactly when he was born. At the time, they cared a lot about astrologers. Well, we just know too few because he was like a mask in public, right? He had to fulfill that role, but he was already so different, say, from his grandfather, Louis IX, but just for the fact that, of course, these people were saints. Say, like Louis IX in his own life probably was already recognized as such, and they had their own blood, their Capetian blood, by the way, so one that has this such enormous ancestry and legacy to begin with, was for them like that claim of imperial necessity, really their trait, the fact that they had to be that, and they had to embody it, and they had to act exactly in the same way. So again, so much to say, probably too much to say, but I'm glad we can have this conversation. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.